This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by the One for the Week newsletter. One for the Week is a free weekly newsletter delivering to your inbox one resource related to presentation skills, writing, or persuasion. Infographics, articles, and commentary in One for the Week can be applied right away to boost your effectiveness on campus, in the corridors of power when talking to policymakers, and across the corporate landscape. Interested in getting free insights in your inbox to help you achieve your goals? Go to onefortheweek.com to join 1,000 subscribers getting the resources for moving ahead. It's great to have Dr. Colin Gray on the show today. Colin is the founder of the podcasthost.com, which is a top resource on the web for podcast education, and also operates a network of podcasts from mountain biking to space exploration, while helping individuals or businesses create a show of their own. Colin spends a lot of his time speaking on stage through workshops, events, and conferences. He and his team also work with higher education, helping educators use podcasting to enhance their teaching. Colin earned his PhD in research and online education for professional learners from Abertay University, his master's in science in multimedia and interactive systems from Edinburgh Napier University, and his bachelor's of science in astrophysics from the University of Edinburgh. Welcome to the show, Colin. Wonderful to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mark.
So I'd like to start by asking you about your career path, beginning with your work in astrophysics, because it's not something that we typically come across when we're talking to folks on the show. And I would love to know what drew you to that specialty.
Yeah, I think I've got pretty strong memories of being a kid, sort of early teenager, and sitting out on my back garden in a camp chair with a sleeping bag over my knees and a pair of binoculars in hand, staring up at the stars. And I was just geeky that way. I think I just loved astronomy. I loved looking into that. I joined I think it was called the British Astronomical Society when I was like 12 or something. And they sent you all these star maps and all this kind of stuff. And I loved looking out there and just learning the constellations and thinking about everything that was out there. So I think that's where it started. And then I got into physics, obviously, in secondary school fully. Started to get quite good at that. And it just became the natural choice, actually, to combine the two. I thought I'd go along and learn everything there was to know about space and then do something with that as a job. But obviously turned out that wasn't true.
Yeah, that's my next question. Is like the transition from space to cyberspace. How did that happen? And how did you manage that transition?
Yeah, it's a good question. I try and think back and figure it out sometimes. And it was definitely something around the fact that I loved the practicality of astronomy. You were out there looking at the stars, you were learning it. You kind of learned the constellations, all that kind of stuff. You could look at the moon and see the actual surface of it. That was just so cool. But then I loved the idea of the theory when you got deeper and learning, I don't know, all of the different things around cosmology and how planets work and all that kind of stuff. But there was just a dissatisfaction that kind of grew in me, I think, over the 4 years where I didn't really know what it was at the time. But looking back and thinking about it more recently, I think it was definitely something around just the fact that I know now that I'm a maker, a kind of creator. I like doing things. I like making things and making a difference. And I think it was just the kind of idea that you can't really affect anything out there started to instill in me. And I just got a bit dissatisfied with that side of it. And that kind of took away from, you need some real motivation to learn the amount of maths that you need to know for astrophysics. It gets difficult. And I just didn't have that motivation because I knew it didn't really affect that much. And that's not to play down the science of astrophysics. And that ties into all sorts of practicalities. But to me at that time, I just didn't see where I was going to take it and make a real difference in the world.
That makes a lot of sense. We're trying to discover what's out there affecting how things actually rotate and move is probably above our pay grade, if you will. And then you really delved into e-learning, and that's an area of expertise for you. And the one question that I have on this one is the difference between the way people learn in person and online. Of course, we're still in the midst of the pandemic, maybe a different phase of it. But nonetheless, many of us had to make big changes, or new folks who had to make big changes in the way they learned and consumed information from in person to online. Given your expertise, what's your take on that?
Yeah, it is a hugely different environment, of course, but there's so many subtleties to it that it's really interesting, actually. The big part of it that really related to my work around it was attention, essentially. You have this manufactured attention when you have people in person, don't you? Because you've got them in a lecture theatre for an hour. And do you teach in person, Mark, these days?
Both, really,
Yeah,
online and in person. Yeah.
you do both. Yeah. The experience that of sitting in front of a lecture hall and they're staring at you, but actually, I say you've got their attention for an hour, but it doesn't always work that way, does it? But online, it's even worse. It's far worse because they can actually just leave and go and do something else. And most of the online learning that you'll find out there is self-service as well, as in you don't have to turn up at a particular time. It's just you have to log on during a particular week and do particular tasks, but it's it's all self-managed. And that is really tricky. That was where my work went. How to create online learning that can still captures people's attention and generate that success, that learning that is really difficult to generate, even when you've got people captive in a lecture theatre. So there's a whole lot in there really around that attention side of things. One of the big things for me is that it had to be really goal based in the first place, even more goal based than normal learning, adult learning in particular. Adults need to know exactly what they're going to get out of it. What's in it for me? You're selfish, aren't you? At the core of it, as a human, you want to know what's
Mhm.
in it for you. So being able to communicate that at the start was really important. And then I moved on to testing, developing a lot of kind of techniques around really short and sharp lessons. Like a lot of the online learning that I ended up developing was it would be something like a 5 or 6 minute lesson once a day through the whole week. So rather than giving somebody 30 minutes of material at the start of a week and ask them to work through that on their own, I would give them a lesson a day that drip fed out, that really develops that attention every single day, that habit of learning, but it's really short and easy to complete. And it's a really defined, concise, prescriptive thing that they're going to learn. But building on that, it had to have, I found, certainly real world context. I found that was even more important in online learning too. It had to be put into this person's real world context somehow. So you can give them a bit of theory, but there has to be some kind of a case study or an example of how this applies in real life. Maybe it's somebody else that's done it before, or maybe it's how you've done it, or maybe it's just examples and case studies and things like that. And then the final part of it really was the action. And I think this is what a lot of people fall down on when they're creating online learning. It's they think that they just have to teach something and it just drops into their head and molds them somehow. But I found even more so again with online learning compared to classroom learning, the action is so important, like actually giving them that 5 minute lesson, maybe up to 10, but there's one or two things that they have to do at the end of it. And even better, if those one or two things actually have a real world context. In my case, I was teaching entrepreneurs and business people in a lot of cases. So if I was teaching them how to use Twitter to market their company, the task might be something like, here's one thing you can do to your bio to generate engagement. And they'd actually go and do it. And not only are they learning and completing a task, but that task actually helps them progress in real life. That has actual real life consequences. So those things all together, I found, helped you to generate a lot more attention around online learning, which helped with that kind of self-service aspect to build that habit and come back again and again. And it really helped to build that success that made people really happy with the courses they took.
Yeah. So insightful, Colin. Thanks for that. As I think about that, one thing that jumps out right away is the person gets a reward. Okay, the bio is better, or
Yeah.
more people are connecting with you as a result of changes that you've made. And that feels good in the brain and something that we're always looking for. And making it digestible, really helpful. Those are probably elements that listeners could be looking for, say, as they're deciding whether or not they want to take an online course, as they're looking at different online courses, which are becoming more, I don't know if popular is the right word, but maybe more normalized everywhere as people are wondering, how can I learn in different places and on my own schedule and learn later in life as well? Now, you made the transition also, again, I don't know if this is phase 3 or part 3 of your journey, but whatever, it's
Too
really
many
interesting.
phases.
Yeah, it's great though, because I'm sure you bring learnings and lessons and perspective, insights from all these other aspects of your life as you move to the next one, which can really lead to a lot of innovation. If you could talk a little bit about making this transition now from academic to startup founder. A lot of our listeners are interested in startups and have heard a lot about entrepreneurship, maybe thinking about that as a potential future. What was it like for you as you navigated that?
Yeah, it was interesting. I have to be honest, like a lot of people, I hedged a lot, actually.
Mhm.
I took a while to transition. I worked at the uni at Napier for 5 or 6 years, I think, in the end. And in year four, I was getting a bit itchy and just wanted to try a couple of my own things. And I actually transitioned down to 4 days a week with Napier. So I was lucky enough, and many people out there will be the same position, I suppose, that academia, certainly in the UK, they're pretty flexible. If you ask to change your working hours, that kind of thing, to do other projects, then they have to be receptive to it at least. And often they were quite, so my work were really super receptive to that. So I ended up working 4 days at the uni and then doing a day a week on my own projects and just testing things out and trying things out, still having that safety net of the real job. And then a year later, they were going fine. So I moved to 3 days a week and I had a 3 day, 2 day split. And actually, I hedged even more because at that point I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to move into running my own company. I want to do something myself. But again, I was almost a little bit too risk averse or maybe too scared potentially to just
Mhm.
jump straight
Sure.
in. And that was when I applied for my PhD because actually I'd been looking around to see if I could find a PhD that related to the work that I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to create courses, education, teach as I did. And I found a PhD that let me research that and create some courses that potentially I could use in future as well. And of course, as well as I mark that a PhD it's hard work, but it certainly doesn't take up, it's not a traditional 9 to 5 job, 5 days a week for most PhD
Right.
students. So it gives you that flexibility to experiment, to learn, to play around with things, to try different things, to learn all sorts during that time you have. It gave me that 3 years to really do all the experimentation I needed to hopefully make a success of what I was going to do. But at the end of the day, if I failed, I had the best degree I could have to go and get a job again. So that was my risk averse version of jumping into it, which potentially defies some of the advice you hear, which is go on, take a risk, jump into it. But yeah, maybe that's just not how I think potentially.
I think it's super smart. And I know it's probably not possible for all listeners who may be in a PhD program right now to do something like that. But if it were, it is a great way for you to test while still having that insurance policy, which removes a lot of the anxiety from the equation. So if people do have an opportunity and they're in a flexible environment to do that, you're road testing something, but you can always go back. You can always come back and finish the PhD if your situation permits that. I just think it's a really smart, gradual way of approaching things. Or even if you're in a situation where you're in a job and you're not happy, you're thinking, what can I do maybe on the side if I can make time for it while still having that fallback? So, really insightful. Thank you for that. And I want to ask you about the skills. Now you've got your startups, and we're going to get to that because I know listeners are going to want to hear about what you're doing right now. Is the skills that you built up to that point when you were getting ready to take, ultimately, when you're getting ready to take that leap? PhD skills, analytical skills associated with the academic side of things that in your case you found were transferable to success as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, loads, absolutely loads. It's hard to overestimate how much I use still from my academic days. Just generally knowing how to conduct research in a good and thorough and rigorous way, how to evaluate research as well. Like even in an industry and commercial space, you find these research studies that purport to say this is the case, and you can read it as a actual trained researcher and say, I don't think that's really telling us. That's not what it means. That's all really valuable. You don't just believe everything. You can really be analytical about it. Simply like maths and numbers. Like it comes into everything you do from the finances, which is the kind of important part or the obvious part. But even more recently, we conducted a survey in our industry. We surveyed something like 2,000 of our audience, people that read our website, that
Mm.
listen to our podcast, that watch our videos. And we were looking for kind of trends in the podcast industry with independent podcasters in particular. And we got this huge data set. And I ended up doing all the research on it because I just did a couple of little things that I know in Excel, like pivot tables and things,
Mhm.
stuff you get taught. And it was like I was like performing actual magic to my team. They were like, how does this? I have no idea what you're doing. It was crazy. So, like little things that you can take for granted, having spent 3 years learning them as a PhD student, actually come in really handy in industry. And the funny one as well is just actually simply writing. As an academic, you write a lot, don't you? You even can be trained in writing as well. But even if you don't, you just get a lot of practice. And there's so much writing in running a business, whether it's communicating with people and your team, even just emails and Slack and stuff, being clear and knowing how to put a clear message out there that way. That's really important. To put in funding applications or applying to a support program or writing your marketing copy for like your sales site, that kind of stuff. I think the fact that I still write a lot of that stuff, I still contribute to so much of that in my company, even though I've got other people that help with that as well. I think that's down to the fact that it just as an academic, I had to become a good writer. And that's a skill I use every single day.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Because sometimes people feel they're transitioning, they want to transition, but how relevant could their academic work be to, say, a life sciences consulting company? But they underestimate some of these skills that you're talking about and how valuable they are. And when you get out there in the world, just like some of your colleagues were amazed that you could do pivot tables in Excel, I cannot do pivot tables in Excel, just for the record. Never heard of it, never done it. Is that skills maybe you take for granted when you're in the academy because everyone, all your colleagues in your lab or whatever, also know how to do these things, but you get out there in the broader world and you're an expert in these things compared to other people.
Yeah.
And that's really fun and interesting. I want to get to what you're doing now because it's really cool. And I'd love for you to talk about thepodcasthost.com, what that's all about, and also Alitu, your platform, and all of the things that that can do with respect to podcasts and the functionality there.
Yeah, thanks. The podcast host came out of actually work I did at the university at Napier. I was a learning technology lecturer. So I ran our what was it called again? I can't even remember the name of it. It was a master's that we ran to teach lecturers how to be better with tech, anyway, to teach their students.
Mhm.
And podcasting was this interesting new tech that came along in like 2006, 2000. It existed before then, but that's when it came to our notice. And I was asked by the leader of the program to look into it and see if it was worth teaching to our lecturers. And so I did. And I promptly fell in love with the medium. I just love the kind of the long form, the personality that comes through on it, the intimacy between you and the listener. There's so much that's so great about it. And so I just started writing what I was learning, partly to teach the lecturers at the uni I was working at, but partly just for the public. And it was an open website, and that was thepodcasthost.com that I started. And so just over the years, I contributed more blogs to that. I created more articles. I started running a podcast around it, a video channel as well. And that just happened to grow a bit of an audience, and people became interested. And I was lucky enough that we started to get some opportunities to earn some money from it as well. And that was really the point where I started to transition down, as I said, to 4 days to 3 days, as that kind of started to take off. So we started to build courses there. And these days, the podcast host is essentially a website that has nearly 1,000 articles on how to run a really good, successful podcast, everything from launch to monetization to growing your audience. And we have courses in there as well on just about anything you can think of related to podcasting, again, from launch, but to editing, to speaking skills, all that kind of stuff. So it's really good fun. It's getting to teach essentially. And the whole goal being just to help anyone really to start their own podcast and get their own message out there into the world. And Alitu relates to that in that Alitu is a software product that we built based on the audience we gathered around the podcast host. And the biggest problem they always told us was, I just hate editing. It takes too long.
Right.
I need to learn like equalization and compression and all this stuff. I need to become an audio engineer just to get this thing out in the world. And I was like, I've learned a bit of software development over the years, a wee bit of web development, that kind of stuff. Maybe I can build something that can do this. And I ended up hiring other people to do it in the end. But the prototype through to the actual kind of design, to the building, it was a really interesting process. And we ended up building Alitu, which is now, it started out just as an editing app on the web, making it much easier to edit your audio. And now it does call recording, it does audio cleanup, it does the editing side of things, it does hosting, and it does transcriptions too. We've got this pair, which is the content that tells you how to do stuff over at the podcast host, and then the tool Alitu, which helps you actually do it. So that's where we ended up.
Yeah, really cool. Of course, we'll have links to Alad2 and the podcasthost.com and other resources that Colin's talking about because they are so helpful. As we wrap up, what advice do you have for listeners who may be PhD grads or working on their PhDs, thinking about starting a company or maybe joining a startup?
Yeah, sure. I think a bit of it relates to what we were saying earlier around the kind of flexibility you have, the time you have to really learn different things. And you're often encouraged in a PhD to broaden your skills, not just in what you're studying, but take on other little courses and all that kind of stuff. So take those opportunities because it's really easy to just concentrate too much on just your research, just what you're doing. But in a university environment, there's so much flexibility to go out there and do other things and learn other things. Related to that is the opportunity you have to really build your network as well. And it's something that people shy away from sometimes, but it's so valuable knowing so many different people in different skill sets and different industries and different spaces. And often universities will have maybe an entrepreneurial society or a business club or something like that. So if it's something you think you might be interested in, certainly go and join that because there's definitely a shift in mindset when you go from academia to business and having to actually think about how to earn money out of this work that you're doing. So it's worthwhile going along to that. And towards the end of your PhD too, certainly I got a bit of support financially and educationally from the university because and I'm not, you could have a look to see if you're out there studying just now, if this applies to your uni, but a lot of universities are looking to show how practical their education is by supporting students to turn it into something real and tangible, an actual business to put into practice. Yeah, I think that's really valuable.
So true. Colin Gray, this has been a wonderful interview. In such a short time, you've dropped a lot of knowledge on folks, very practical information. Like I said, we'll have links to resources that you mentioned in the show notes. Continued good luck and success with your endeavors. Thanks for being on the show.
No, you too, Mark, and well done for getting the past 200 episodes. That is not a small feat for a podcaster. So you're doing an absolutely great job there as well.
Thanks. And listeners, thanks for being along on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you will be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.